Sarah Mitchell gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles white from the cold. The heater blasted at full power, yet the icy wind still crept through the car's tiny cracks, sending chills down her spine. The thermometer on the dashboard flashed a brutal -4 degrees Fahrenheit. The road ahead stretched endlessly, empty except for the snow-covered trees bending under the weight of the storm. She just wanted to get home before the weather worsened. But then something caught her eye. A dark figure stood out against the snow, just past the tree line. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She slowed the car, her breath fogging up the windshield as her headlights swept over it. Not a shadow, not a trick of the light. It was a dog, a German shepherd, tied to a tree, barely moving, covered in snow. A wave of horror hit her. Who could do something this cruel? Sarah slammed the brakes, threw the car into park, and jumped out. The freezing wind slashed through her coat like a knife, but she didn't care. Her boots crunched against the frozen ground as she ran toward the dog. The closer she got, the worse it became. The shepherd wasn't just tied up, he was dying. His fur was stiff with frost, his ribs painfully visible beneath his matted coat. The rope around his neck was so tight, so frozen, it looked like a noose. Sarah dropped to her knees beside him. "Hey buddy, can you hear me?" Her voice trembled. No response. She reached out, pressing her shaking fingers gently against his side. A faint rise and fall. He was alive, but just barely. Her chest tightened. She had to get him out of here. Sarah grabbed the rope and pulled with everything she had, but it wouldn't budge. Frozen solid. Panic surged through her. He whimpered weakly, barely lifting his head. His eyes, hollow and dull, locked onto hers. And for the first time she saw it. A flicker of hope. But Sarah had no idea what was still to come. The cold bit at her fingers as she desperately clawed at the frozen rope, but it was like trying to break steel. The dog lay completely still, his breath shallow, his body barely responding to her touch. She needed something sharp. Fast. Frantically, she scanned the ground. Nothing. Just snow, ice, and a few useless branches. Then, her car keys. It wasn't much, but it was all she had. She yanked them from her pocket and jammed the metal into the frozen knot, twisting, scraping, trying anything to loosen it. The shepherd let out a soft whimper. His body shuddered, but there was no fight left in him. Sarah's heart clenched. If she didn't get him free now, he wouldn't make it. She twisted the key harder, her raw knuckles scraping against the ice. Then crack. The ice splintered. She yanked the rope. Nothing. Again nothing. Tears burned in her eyes. Come on, come on. And then snap. The knot gave way. The rope unraveled, falling away like a broken chain. For a split second, relief flooded her. But then the shepherd collapsed. Sarah's breath caught. He wasn't moving. No. No. She tore off her coat, wrapping it around him, her hands trembling as she pressed them to his chest. A faint rise and fall. Still alive, but barely. Her mind raced. She had freed him, but that wasn't enough. If she didn't get him warm now, he wouldn't survive. She had no choice. Sarah bent down, wrapped her arms around him, and lifted his fragile body. He was too light, far too light for a dog his size. He let out a weak whimper as she cradled him close, trying to share her warmth. "I've got you," she whispered. "I'm not letting you go." The freezing wind howled as she staggered back to the car. She didn't know if she was already too late. She didn't know if he could hold on. But she knew one thing. She wasn't leaving him behind. Sarah tore off her gloves and pressed her bare hands against his frozen ribs. The contact made her gasp. His skin was like ice. But she didn't pull away. She leaned over slightly, one hand on the wheel, the other on his chest. "Come on, buddy," she whispered. "Stay with me." The car sped through the dark road, headlights barely cutting through the thick, freezing mist. Minutes passed. He didn't move. Sarah bit her lip hard. The taste of blood filled her mouth. Then a sound. Weak. Raspy. Her eyes widened. She glanced down. The shepherd's nose twitched slightly. A faint, broken whimper escaped his throat. Sarah's breath hitched. "That's it." She choked on the words, heart pounding. Pressing her palm firmly against his side again, she felt it. A slight shift, a fragile fight to hold on. He wasn't giving up. Neither was she. Her foot slammed on the gas. The car barreled through the icy road toward the vet clinic. She didn't care about speed limits. Didn't care about the danger. She wasn't going to let him die. The car screeched to a stop in front of the vet clinic, tires skidding on the icy pavement. The fluorescent emergency sign flickered, casting an eerie glow over the entrance. Sarah barely threw the car into park before flinging the door open and rushing to the passenger seat. The German shepherd wasn't moving. Her stomach dropped. "Hey! I need help," she yelled, her voice cracking. She wrapped her arms around the limp, frozen body, pulling him into her chest. The cold bit through her soaked clothes as she staggered toward the door, her breath coming in short, desperate gasps. Then, the clinic doors burst open. A woman in scrubs and a winter coat rushed out. "Bring him inside," she ordered, eyes widening at the shepherd's frail state. Sarah stumbled through the entrance, the warm air hitting her like a wave. She hadn't realized how cold she was, how numb her fingers had become. But it didn't matter. The vet tech guided her to a treatment table, where another staff member was already preparing supplies. Sarah carefully laid the shepherd down. He didn't react. The machine next to the table beeped as the vet tech pressed a stethoscope to his frail chest. Her face tightened. His breathing is too shallow. Too slow. His body is stiff from the cold. Sarah's fists clenched. "He was tied to a tree," she whispered, voice shaking. I found him freezing out there. The rope was so tight, I thought." She stopped herself, swallowed the lump in her throat. "I don't know how long he was out there, but he barely made it." The vet tech nodded, her expression grim. "We're going to do everything we can." Then, a sharp voice from the hallway. "Get Dr. Carter in here. Now." Sarah's chest tightened. Seconds later, a tall woman in a white coat rushed into the room, brown hair tied back in a messy bun. "Dr. Emily Carter, the head veterinarian. What's his temperature?" Dr. Carter asked sharply. A nurse checked the screen and grimaced. "Too low to read." Sarah's heart plummeted. Dr. Carter's expression remained calm, but her voice was firm. "We need to warm him up immediately. For fluids, heat pads, and get the oxygen ready now." Sarah stepped back, pulse racing as the team sprang into action. Warm blankets. And 4 catheter. An oxygen mask carefully placed over his muzzle. She watched, hands clenched into fists. Minute after agonizing minute stretched on. Dr. Carter checked his heartbeat, her eyes narrowing. His pulse is weak, but stable. For now. Sarah swallowed hard. Is he going to survive? Dr. Carter exhaled slowly. "It's too soon to tell." Sarah's chest tightened painfully. But then, Dr. Carter glanced at the shepherd's frail body. "He's still fighting." Sarah's breath hitched. That was enough. She placed a hand on the edge of the table, whispering, "You're not alone anymore." The shepherd didn't respond. But for the first time, his ears twitched. Sarah sat in the dimly lit waiting room, hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had turned white. The rhythmic ticking of the wall clock echoed in her ears. Each second stretched unbearably. Beyond the closed doors, the German shepherd lay wrapped in heated blankets, and 4 pumping warmth into his frail body. Sarah barely noticed that her coat was soaked from the snow, that her fingers burned from the cold. She only cared about one thing. Would he make it? Then, the door creaked open. Sarah jumped to her feet. Dr. Carter stepped out, her white coat slightly wrinkled, her expression unreadable. Sarah's breath caught. "Is he?" Dr. Carter nodded. "He's still with us." Sarah's knees almost buckled in relief. "He's extremely weak," Dr. Carter continued, "but his vitals have stabilized. His temperature is rising. That's a good sign." Sarah let out a shaky breath. "Can I see him?" Dr. Carter hesitated, then nodded. "He's still unconscious, but I think he could use someone by his side." Sarah didn't waste a second. She followed the vet into the treatment room, her heart hammering. The shepherd lay motionless on the padded table, wrapped tightly in blankets. A small oxygen mask rested over his muzzle, and the soft beeping of the monitors filled the air. He looked so fragile. Sarah slowly approached. Standing beside him, she whispered, "Hey, buddy." The dog didn't move. Her chest tightened. A lump formed in her throat. What if she had been too late? Then a flicker. His ear twitched. Sarah froze. Then his eyelids fluttered. Just slightly. She gasped softly, her fingers curling into the blanket beside him. "That's it, you're okay now." His breathing was still weak. But he was fighting. Dr. Carter stepped forward, her voice softer this time. "He needs time. His body is in shock, and he's extremely malnourished. We'll run tests for internal damage. But for now, the most important thing is that he's alive." Sarah nodded, throat tight with emotion. Her fingers brushed against the dog's matted fur. Someone had done this to him. Left him to die. Tied up. Helpless. Her jaw clenched. She had to find out who. Then, Dr. Carter spoke again. "We checked for a microchip." Sarah's head snapped up. "And?" Dr. Carter hesitated. "He has one." Sarah's breath hitched. Then, Dr. Carter's eyes met hers, unreadable. The owner is someone local. Sarah's stomach dropped. Someone in this town did this. And she was going to find out who. The town had done this. And now, she was going to find out who. Sarah's mind raced as she stared at Dr. Carter. A microchip. That meant this dog wasn't just some abandoned stray. Someone had owned him. Someone had left him to die. Her hands curled into fists. Who does he belong to? Dr. Carter hesitated, glancing at the unconscious shepherd wrapped in blankets. Legally, I can't give out personal details without reporting it first, she said carefully. But I can tell you this, his registered owner is from this town. Sarah felt a wave of anger boil beneath her exhaustion. She swallowed hard. Do you know if they've reported him missing? Dr. Carter exhaled sharply. No. Sarah's breath hitched. No report. No lost posters. Whoever owned him never wanted him back. Her voice was quieter now. Do you have a name? Dr. Carter's lips pressed into a thin line. Then finally she nodded. Sarah braced herself. And then she heard it. Her blood ran cold. She knew that name. It took a second to process. But when it hit hard. No, she whispered. That can't be right. Dr. Carter's expression was grim. I double-checked. Sarah's stomach churned. She hadn't just heard the name before. She had met the man. A respected business owner. Someone people trusted. And yet, he had left this dog to die. Her fingers trembled as she looked down at the shepherd, his frail body barely moving under the blankets. How could anyone do this? She swallowed the lump in her throat. What happens now? Dr. Carter crossed her arms. Legally, we have to notify the registered owner before placing the dog in anyone else's care. Sarah's heart pounded. You're telling me we have to call him? Dr. Carter hesitated. If we don't, and he comes looking for the dog later, it could complicate things. But based on what you found, she shook her head. I don't think he's going to want him back. Sarah exhaled slowly, her head spinning. Her gut told her this wasn't just neglect. Something worse had happened. She looked back at the shepherd, his breathing still weak, his body still fragile. And in that moment she knew. She wasn't going to let him go back. Not to a man who had tied him to a tree in the freezing cold. Not to someone who had abandoned him to die. Sarah clenched her jaw. I want to adopt him. Dr. Carter blinked in surprise. Sarah, he's in rough shape. He may never fully recover. I don't care. Dr. Carter studied her for a long moment. Then, her expression softened. We'll see what happens when we make the call, she said. But if the owner refuses to claim him, he's yours. Sarah felt her pulse hammering. Because she already knew the truth. No one was coming for him. And maybe that was for the best. Sarah sat rigidly in the small office inside the clinic, her hands clenched into fists. Dr. Carter dialed the number. The room was eerily quiet, except for the soft beeping of the heart monitor from the treatment room. Beyond that door, the German shepherd, her dog now in every way that mattered, was still fighting for his life. And now, she was about to hear the voice of the man who had tried to end it. Dr. Carter pressed the phone to her ear. Sarah could hear it ringing. Once. Twice. Then a voice. Yeah. The tone was gruff. Impatient. Dr. Carter's expression didn't change. Hello, this is Dr. Emily Carter from Westfield Veterinary Clinic. We have a dog registered to your name. The man cut her off immediately. What dog? Sarah's blood ran cold. Dr. Carter remained calm. A German shepherd. He was found tied to a tree in freezing temperatures. Nearly died. He's chipped under your name. Silence. Sarah held her breath. Then, the man laughed. A short, bitter chuckle. Oh, that mutt. He scoffed. I got rid of him days ago. Sarah's jaw clenched so hard it hurt. Got rid of him? Dr. Carter repeated, voice dangerously measured. Yeah, the man continued carelessly. He was useless. Weak. I don't need a dog that can't. He stopped himself. Then sighed. Look, do what you want with him. I don't care. Sarah felt sick. Every ounce of her self-control hung by a thread. Dr. Carter, to her credit, remained professional. So you're surrendering ownership? The man snorted. He's not mine anymore. Sarah couldn't take it. She grabbed the phone from Dr. Carter's hand. You tied him to a tree and left him to die, she said, voice shaking with anger. The man hesitated. Then he snorted. Lady, it's just a dog. Sarah's hands trembled. Dr. Carter gently took the phone back before Sarah could say what she really wanted to. We'll take care of him, she said flatly. And then she hung up. The call ended. Sarah sat there, heart hammering. Dr. Carter exhaled. Well, that's that. Sarah swallowed back the rage burning in her chest. So if he's mine now? She asked, voice still raw. Dr. Carter nodded, a small, knowing smile playing on her lips. He's yours. A noise from the treatment room. A soft whimper. Sarah's head snapped toward the door. She didn't hesitate. She rushed back into the room. There, wrapped in blankets, his frail body barely moving, was the shepherd. But this time, his eyes were open. Really open. Not dull. Not lifeless. He was looking at her. He saw her. Sarah's throat tightened. She slowly reached out, placing a gentle hand on his head. He didn't flinch. Instead, his weak tail thumped against the table. Sarah let out a soft, broken laugh, tears burning in her eyes. You're safe now, buddy, she whispered. And this time, he believed her. Rex was left to die. But he refused to give up. And neither did Sarah. Now, after everything he's been through, he finally has a second chance at life. What do you think should happen next in Rex's journey? Let us know in the comments. And if this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share so more people can hear stories of resilience, hope, and second chances.